Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today here for the Archives Unmasked, a conversation on face masks and culture event. We are so happy that you were able to join us. I would like to start with a few just housekeeping kind of things. You'll notice as you come in that you won't be able to toggle the mute button right now. And we just set that feature up so that we can make sure we get through the presentation portion uninterrupted. But when we get to the discussion portion, we'll be sure to turn that off and you'll be able to mute and unmute yourself as you would like. The other thing we want to mention is we are recording this session, at least the presentation portion, but once we get to the discussion, we will turn the recording off, and that's so that everyone can feel free to speak freely. The other thing is we do want this to be an interactive and an engaging presentation. So throughout our presentation, you'll see some polls, some Zoom polls pop up on your screen. And that's just so we can get an idea of different perspectives and experiences in today's group. We do invite you to participate in the polls. They're fully anonymous and we won't be saving any of that information. And I think lastly, we do encourage you to write any of your comments or reactions or questions that occur to you during this presentation in the chat box as we go through, and we'll refer back to those during our discussion period. And yeah, we'll just go ahead and get started. So I would like to start us off with a statement of solidarity. I want to acknowledge that we are living in very difficult and unprecedented times right now. And as members of the UCR community, we stand with Black Lives Matters against racial injustice, police brutality, and other human rights violations. We also recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, the Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, as well as their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Though we now meet in digital spaces through Zoom, we do invite you to learn whose ancestral lands you're physically located on by visiting the website native-land.ca. And so now I'll properly introduce myself. My name is Sandy Enriquez, and I am the Public Services Outreach and Community Engagement Librarian.
And I am Andrea Hoff. I'm the University Archivist.
Okay. So I'll do a brief agenda for today's event. We were really inspired to do this event because we've seen a lot of interest pop up about the previous pandemic of 1918. At least in my experience, I've seen so many webinars and even digital exhibits pop up about this topic. But none of these events have really bridged the previous pandemic to our current pandemic through the shared symbol of the face mask. So that kind of inspired today's event. We wanted to create a space for our community to kind of share some of our own experiences and our thoughts and feelings about wearing face masks in this pandemic. And so we wanted to utilize our expertise as archivists and librarians to kind of give some historical context to the usage of face masks in the previous pandemic, and also give some contemporary information about the different ways that we are using face masks today. So Andrea will be starting us off with photographs part 1, looking at face masks in the archive, and then I'll take over for photographs part 2, which will explore face masks as contemporary cultural objects. And then at the end, we'll come together. I'll turn off screen share so we can have a facilitated conversation. And we do invite you to practice self-care during this conversation. So if you would prefer to keep your camera off, or you would prefer to dialogue with us through the chat box, that's perfectly okay. We want to make sure that you're comfortable. And so we're going to start with our first poll of the day, just to get a feel for how everyone's doing or how everyone's experience has been so far. And so the question is, which kind of face mask do you currently use the most? And I will go ahead and launch that poll right now. So you should see a little pop-up box on your screen. And I'll leave that open for a few seconds as people start voting. Okay, it's going. And then I'll share the results in just a few seconds. All right, looks like everyone has responded. So let's go ahead and share results. Yeah, I kind of suspected that the reusable face mask would probably be like the top result, and that's interesting, followed by single use and homemade. Very cool. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Okay. Just go ahead and stop that. And then I'll let Andrea take it from here.
Okay. So let me just share my screen here. Hopefully everyone can see the presentation. I see that it's still loading, but I'll just go ahead and get started while we wait. I'm excited to talk about this research that I've been doing on face masks today because it's been really fun for me to kind of look around at other archives throughout the US and see what they have, since most of my research is generally focused on our collections at UCR. So it's been really nice to branch out a little bit. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully you can all see the presentation now. It looks like it loaded. So the use of face masks during pandemics really starts, as Sandy mentioned, during the 1918 flu pandemic. And if you look at the historical sources, you'll find that the use of face masks was really quite widespread during this pandemic. And you can find images of them being worn in multiple different contexts. I found some really great images from the National Archives, like this one that you're looking at now of a letter carrier in New York City wearing a face mask. There's also this one from a barber shop in Cincinnati, where you can see both of the barbers are wearing face masks as they provide services. And then I also found this one again from the National Archives, a group of conductorettes in New York City wearing face masks. And I believe they're subway conductorettes, I'm not really sure, but these images show us the variety of contexts in which face masks were worn during the pandemic of 1918. So I also found a really great article from the San Francisco Chronicle that was published on October 25th, 1918, in which various city leaders, including the city health officer, are shown wearing face masks on the front page of the newspaper. And this was published the day after the Board of Supervisors passed a mandatory mask wearing ordinance for the city. And actually, this is the city health officer right here. His name is Dr. William Hassler. He's second from the right in the top row. And remember him because he'll come back during this presentation again later. And you can see the headline here says, "Wear your mask, commands drastic new ordinance, how they look in their influenza masks." And this article is really interesting because it talks about the different types of face masks that were being worn at the time. And the descriptions are so vivid that I really actually wanted to read a few excerpts from the article itself. It says, and this is a quote, "All sorts and conditions of masks were in evidence, most of them simple affairs. Mere pads of gauze, 4 folds thick, tied on the face with tape that went around the head above the ears and around the neck below them. Others affect masks of a more neutralized anesthetic, flattened, complex type, like nose bags. Still others, more highly developed and complex in the scheme of construction and medical efficacy, were fearsome-looking machines, like extended muzzles, some of metal, some of ivory, or similar substance, all suggestive of surgical instruments, and lending a pig-like aspect to the wearer, an unnaturally pig-like extension of the snout." So I just wanted to share that very vivid description of these face masks. And then the article actually goes on to discuss the different types of masks. And it talks about one called the Agincourt, which the writer describes as having a snout extended partially like the helmets affected by the French knights at the period of Agincourt. And I believe what that one refers to is this type of mask that you can see the men in this photo are wearing, that has kind of this like flap sticking out from it. I actually looked up what French knights wore during this period, and it was sort of like a beak-like type of helmet. And so I believe that's what this Agincourt mask is. And you can see, again, here the woman in the center of this photo wearing that type of mask as well. And then they talk a little bit about masks typically worn by police officers. And the article says, the police affect the small serviceable gauze pad type of mask, resembling in size and contour about 9 ordinary slabs of ravioli arranged in a square. So I found these 2 photos of police officers from this time wearing this type of mask. This one, I love the caption. Somebody wrote underneath, "Get one like this right away." And I believe it's because that's what the police officer is telling this woman on the right who is not wearing a mask. So, so this article also references another kind of mask called the yashmak, which is described as a harem mask type of veil that is worn by many girl clerks and women in downtown offices. It hangs loose below the chin and has not such a disturbing, sad, flattening effect upon certain types of female beauty, as has the mask that is tied under the mouth and close to the chin. And I found an example of this as well. In this photo from the National Archives, it shows a female typist in New York City, and it's a little hard to see, but I think you can make out that her mask is kind of hanging under her chin and tied around her neck. So, and the last thing the article talks about that I thought was noteworthy was that it said some women went around with a veil on instead of a mask. And the writer actually says, quote, "Hundreds of women have been compromising between the mask regulations and their dread of uncomeliness by using thick veils. What will become of them if they persist in this form of mask, despite the new and more rigorous regulation, remains to be seen." So sort of a very ominous ending to this newspaper article. But those are basically the different types of masks that were most common at the time, according to my research. And now we actually want to know from all of you a little bit about face masks and fashion. So we're going to do another poll. And the question that we're asking is, actually, let me pull up the poll first. Here we go. Relaunch, okay. Launch polling. So the question asks, do you have a wardrobe of face masks? Are aesthetic choices like designs, colors, or materials important to you? So I'll let everyone answer and then I'll share the results. Okay, I think that's just about everyone. So let me share the results with you. Oh, okay, this is interesting. It's about even. So 47% said yes and 53% said no. That is very good to know. And I think we'll definitely want to hear a little bit more about this later in the discussion. I didn't expect it to be so evenly divided, so that's really interesting. Okay, going to pick up where I left off with the presentation. So as I was saying, about face masks, in terms of who was making and selling the masks, the Red Cross and other civic organizations played a really key role here. This is a photo of the War Camp Community Committee hand sewing face masks at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco. And then the next photo shows Red Cross women selling the face masks. And I read that face masks sold by the Red Cross were sold for 10 cents each. And the day after the mask ordinance was passed in San Francisco, they sold over 15,000 masks at Red Cross headquarters. And I found this photo of people waiting in line for face masks. And you can see some of them have masks on and some of them don't. So it's kind of interesting. And there's a little sign here. It says influenza, wear your mask. Um, so the next thing I want to talk about is something that came up in the article that I just referenced, which is the material used to make face masks. So face masks during the 1918 pandemic were made of gauze, which is a much thinner material, I think, than you would expect. And of course, this is indicative of the fact that they didn't have a very clear understanding of how exactly the virus was transmitted, or how easily it was transmitted, I should say. So I found this photo of a face mask that's actually preserved at the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. This is a face mask from the 1918 pandemic that was preserved in a scrapbook of one of the students from the university. And his name was Alfred Wilkinson Wilson. And it's just sort of remarkable that this has survived, since face masks, then as now, are highly ephemeral. They're not usually meant to last. So I think this is just great because it allows us to really see the material more closely. And the material, as you can see, is quite thin, which is worth noting. And he even saved this little card up here on the right-hand corner of your screen. And I know it's a little bit hard to read because the print is small, but it says, "This mask is to be worn over the mouth and nose at all times except when you are eating. Wear the marked side against the face. The mask should be cleaned every other night before going to bed by washing it in hot soap suds, followed by rinsing it in hot water." So very specific directions for how to wash, when and how to wash the mask. And I'm very curious as to why it says that the marked side should be worn against the face. If you can see on the lower left, this I believe is the marked side. And this is totally conjecture on my part, but I did read in some of my research that some of these masks were medicated. And so I think that might be one reason why you're supposed to wear it with one particular side in. But again, I wasn't able to find anything that really explicitly stated that. So I think that would be a really interesting avenue of further research. But the use of these sort of informational cards is interesting and raises the question of guidelines and how they were written and presented to the public during this time. So this particular bulletin that we're looking at now is probably one of the most widely published ones that you'll find in the literature on the 1918 flu. And this was printed in a publication called the Illustrated Current News on October 18th, 1918 in New Haven, Connecticut. And you can see this photo of a Red Cross nurse next to guidelines for how to prevent the spread of the flu. And so these guidelines are actually pretty similar to, a lot of what we're hearing now. It says, don't take any person's breath, avoid those that cough and sneeze, avoid worry, fear, and fatigue. And then the last one you can see here says, in sick rooms, wear a gauze mask like in illustration. And this is interesting to me because it specifies the need to wear a mask only in a room with sick people, not just generally when you're out in public, like the advice that we're hearing now. So this is actually the same advice that was printed in this pamphlet I found that was printed by the US Public Health Service in September of 1918. This is a 4-page pamphlet with guidelines on how to prevent the spread of the flu. And there's only a brief mention about the use of face masks in here. On page 4, it says, nurses and attendants will do well to guard against breathing in dangerous disease germs by wearing a simple fold of gauze or mask while near the patient. So it seems kind of like the guidelines from this bulletin or from this pamphlet were the ones that were used in this bulletin that I just showed previously. And I also wanted to show the last 2 lines of the pamphlet because they're my favorite. It says, cover up each cough and sneeze. If you don't, you'll spread disease. So I just found that a really charming use of a mnemonic device for the sake of public health. And speaking of mnemonic devices, I found this little jingle that was used during this time to encourage the use of face masks. It says, obey the laws and wear the gauze, protect your jaws from septic paws. Yeah, I had to throw that in there. So these rhymes and jingles and even advertisements were used to encourage the use of masks. But I also found this photo that I thought was really interesting because you can see there's this person on the right who's wearing a placard around their neck that says, "Wear a mask or go to jail." And in fact, there were fines and jail time associated with non-compliance and wearing face masks. So in San Francisco, not wearing a mask was actually a misdemeanor, and you could be fined anywhere from $10 to $100 for not wearing one. And there was actually a term for people who refused to wear face masks. They were referred to as mask slackers, which is a term that I personally enjoy. It just sounds like it should be the name of a grunge band from the 90s or something. But in San Francisco, which was really kind of a hotbed of mask wearing culture and controversy, largely because it was one of the hardest hit cities in the US by this pandemic. The police actually did raids on hotels and various other public places where they enforced compliance with the city mask ordinance. And you can see this newspaper article that we're looking at that I found. It says, the headline says, 1,000 taken as mask slackers. So this kind of describes how they were enforcing this policy really quite aggressively, I guess more aggressively than I would have expected. And sometimes these mask slackers were actually public figures, which is interesting. I read about a very high-profile boxing match that took place right after entertainment venues were reopened. So they had closed all of the dance halls, theaters, and sports arenas and so forth during October of 1918 in San Francisco, and then reopened them in November. And that's when there was this boxing match that took place at the Civic Auditorium. And both the mayor and the city health officer, Dr. Hassler, our friend from the earlier slide that I showed you on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, both of them were there at this boxing match, and they were both caught without their masks on by a very astute photographer who actually sent the photos to the police chief, who fined both the mayor and the city health officer for not wearing masks. And I found these two newspaper articles about that. So you can see the San Francisco's mayor is caught without a mask. Ringside picture reveals maskless fans to police. And I found a quote from the health officer who said that his mask may have slipped off while he was smoking a cigar. Maybe, but who knows? So yeah, I was hoping that I could find the photos, that maybe they had published the photos in the newspaper, but unfortunately they didn't. So obviously masks were contentious back then, and some people did not feel like they should have to wear them. And the AntiMask League was formed in San Francisco in January 1919 as a response to the city instituting another mandatory mask ordinance. So the mask ordinance was basically passed and then repealed a couple of different times. And then after it was passed again in January, that's when this AntiMask League formed. And this is an advertisement for one of their meetings that took place on January 25th, 1919. And it's actually estimated that between 4,000 and 5,000 people attended this meeting. And the president of the league was actually a woman named Mrs. E.C. Harrington. And she's a really interesting figure because she was an attorney, and she was a very important leader in the women's suffrage movement of San Francisco, and a labor rights activist as well. And she was actually the first woman to register to vote in the Bay Area. And her husband was the San Francisco elections registrar. And she was closely associated with the previous mayor of San Francisco, who was in office from 1910 to 1912. And she worked on his re-election campaign, but he lost that to James Rolfe, who then became mayor, and he served during this time of the 1918 pandemic. So because of that transfer of political power, Mrs. Harrington's husband lost his job as the city elections registrar. So when Rolfe became mayor, this obviously had a really negative impact on her life. And a lot of the literature that I read suggests that her feelings about masks were actually motivated by her political opposition to the new mayor of San Francisco, and that this anti-mask activism was motivated by a desire to sort of undermine him. So that covers the historical part of this talk, and I think there are a lot of interesting parallels between masks then and now. And to talk more about masks now, I'm going to hand this over to Sandy, who will give you an idea of the contemporary context surrounding face masks.
Oh, there you go. I almost forgot to unmute myself. Thank you, Andrea. I'm going to take it over from here. Waiting for my screen to load. Okay, so I get the pleasure about going into part 2, face masks as contemporary cultural objects. And this is an interesting section to go over because, as we all know very well, the pandemic is nowhere near ending. So a lot of these types of face masks that I'm going to talk about today will probably continue to evolve. And it'll be interesting to see in the future, to look back and see what kinds of trends have continued and which trends ended up stopping. But my goal in this section is to talk a little bit about how face masks have changed from the previous pandemic, and perhaps think about why that might be and what cultural forces have kind of influenced that. So the first one that I'll talk about is face masks as fashion. So in Andrea's presentation, we saw that there were some changes in the styles of face masks that people wore, whether it was like a longer flap or a more structured kind of format. But in general, all the colors were the same and the material of the gauze seemed to be the same. And in contrast, today there's such a wide plethora of face masks that you can get. I've seen some that are made of cotton or linen or silk or even mesh in the case of the anti-face masks that we'll go over in a few slides. But you can also get all kinds of designs and colors and patterns. So I think this is something that's really changed about the face mask culture in today's world. It's kind of an invitation to be more personalized and kind of a form of self-expression. We also see face masks for accessibility. And this is one of those things that I learned about during my research that perhaps because of my own privilege, I wasn't even thinking about or aware of until I learned about it in these articles. But for a lot of folks that depend on reading lips to kind of move and go about their day, the use of face masks or the prevalence of face masks makes it really difficult for them to continue functioning. So we see now that there are more face masks coming out that have a see-through cover or like a plastic cover to make reading lips more plausible. And we also see face masks with little cartoon characters like you see pictured here. And I've read that a lot of medical professionals will use that kind of imagery so that they're not as frightening to children who may not be accustomed to seeing people in masks. But I thought that was a really interesting role for face masks today. And this is probably my favorite part that I was researching, but face masks as cultural representation. So we're kind of veering away from, the utilitarian purpose of face masks and really looking at face masks as forms of self-expression and statements of cultural belonging. And so here we see 2 photos of homemade masks, and you can tell these are very intricate. These are beautifully designed. And for a lot of cases, there's a lot of significance in the imagery, the colors used, the materials used. And so I think that this trend kind of started up because people were at home and they were in self-isolation and they needed ways to entertain themselves and things to do. And so it's kind of become like a social media trend to create these face masks that kind of draw from your cultural upbringings and then share them online. And it inspires other people to do the same with their cultures. And so you start getting this like snowball effect that's creating a sense of community and creating a sense of solidarity, despite the isolating nature of the pandemic. Kind of similar to that, we're also seeing a wave of face masks as art. And so this isn't just limited to specific cultural norms or traditions, but this is really expanding what do we, think of as a face mask, and what is the meaning of a face mask, and kind of making a more artistic statement on it. And so the photo on the left, the Corona mask, was actually a submission to a contest. And in my research, I found that this was happening a lot. Museums or cultural or art organizations were hosting up virtual contests to encourage people to take the imagery or the symbolism of face masks and kind of create something more creative and make a statement about it. And kind of similar to the face mask as cultural representation, this creates a sense of community. It creates a sense of self-expression and gives you something to do at home and something to create, and perhaps a source of positive inspiration at a time that's like really difficult for a lot of people. So these face masks, while they have powerful statements, their effectiveness, their essence, their utilitarian purpose of mitigating health risk is perhaps not as high. And so they're not as practical for day-to-day use. And that's kind of the next realm that I want to explore, is face masks as luxury status symbols. And I was really surprised to learn about this, because if you go to Target nowadays, you can find out that face masks are maybe like $5 or less. But there are certain luxury designers that are creating face masks, producing face masks for hundreds of dollars. And in some of these cases, the proceeds are going to charitable causes. So perhaps, there's some balance there, but not in all cases. And even with certain designers like Balenciaga here, creating face masks, there's still more demand for them than there is supplies. And so this has created a counterfeit, third market of counterfeit luxury face masks. So people are creating them with like Gucci symbolism or Louis Vuitton like icons. And it's becoming a trendy thing on Instagram, which is what you see in the right-hand side of this page. But I think that, it's interesting to think about like, how does this commercialization of the face mask perhaps impact the necessity of it? Is it fair to profit so highly off of something that should be very easily accessible and affordable for people? Is it perhaps wrong to kind of create this status symbol out of something that is actually a tool for public health? And now going into a little bit more of the controversial face masks. These are known as anti-face masks, and they're worn by protesters, perhaps today's modern equivalent of the mask slackers. But instead of just not wearing masks at all, they're choosing to make a statement by wearing incredibly ineffective masks. So these are like mesh masks, or like just very thin, one single layer gauze masks that are meant to be more of a political statement than any kind of like public health tool. Or you also see face masks that are the same as the ones you'd buy in the store, but they have like messages on them to defend the wearers or to exert their political beliefs. And lastly, I do want to touch on the fact that we have face masks today that are really political statements. And this is probably because of the coincidence that this pandemic occurred at the same time that we have had a rise in social movements like Black Lives Matters. And as you can see on the left-hand side, we see a protester from one of the protests against the murder of George Floyd, and her face mask says, "I can't breathe," which we know were his last words. And so I think this is a really powerful photo, especially when you see it kind of, juxtaposed with this photo from an anti-mask protester who is ironically using a mask, a homemade one, to make a statement as well. And so that kind of leads us to our next poll question, which is, do you agree that a face mask can be an effective political statement? I'll go ahead and get that started. And so you should see that pop up on your screen now. I'll wait a few seconds to get our results. All right, I think we are good. So I'm gonna end poll and share. Yeah, Those are really interesting results. So overwhelmingly, 77% of attendees today have said that yes, they can be an effective political statement, and 23% would argue that no, they are not. Thank you. So we're going to start transitioning to part 3, which is our discussion. But first, I would like to talk about a brief code of conduct. And these are just guidelines, so we can have a safe and respectful discussion today. We ask that you be mindful and that you practice active listening, respect and sensitivity for others, as well as self-care. And by self-care, I mean that you're free to keep your camera off if that's preferable, and you're free to just use the chat box and type in your responses rather than speaking. That's totally up to you, whatever's most comfortable for you. We also will not be tolerating any harmful or disrespectful behavior, so you will be removed from the conversation if you engage in that kind of behavior. And as a reminder, this conversation will not be recorded, so I will go ahead and stop the recording from here.